Hi, my name's April Fellman, and I'll be reporting on a week's worth of weather observations for ATM 101 Alaska Weather and Climate. I'll be doing my observations from my home in Delta Junction, Alaska, located in the interior of the state in the Tanana Valley. I began my weather observations on Saturday, January 28th, and ended them on Wednesday, February 1st. On Saturday, temperatures were extremely cold. The average was -40 on the thermometer, but you must keep in mind that the thermometer will only go as low as -40. Both the minimums and the maximums for Saturday were -40 or below. On Sunday, we saw a little bit of a temperature increase. The minimums on both probes still read below -40. But the maximums were -34.7 on the left probe and -34.6 on the right probe. Moving on to Monday, we saw more increase in temperature, with the minimums in the -30s at -30.2 on the left probe and right probe, and the maximums were -12.7 on both probes. January 31st, the temperature stayed about the same as the previous day, with -30.9 reading as the minimum on the left probe and -30.3 as the minimum on the right probe. Both maximums were recorded at -13.2. On Wednesday, February 1st, the temperature even increased more. The minimums were at -19 and -18.8, and the maximums were 5 degrees on the left probe and 5.1 degrees on the right thermometer probe. So you can see throughout the week we went from temperatures as cold as -40 degrees Fahrenheit or even below that, and by the end of the observation period we were above zero at 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The red line indicates the actual observations that took place when I was at my station, and you can see they pretty much followed the maximum temperatures, and I believe that's because I took my observations between noon and 2 p.m., which is probably about the warmest part of the day because of the position of the sun high in the sky. And as I don't like to be that cold, that's exactly why I took my temperature readings that time of the day, to be as warm as possible, which is not easy to do when your thermometer is reading -40 below. The barometric pressure dropped throughout the week. You can see that we started out the observation period at 971 millibars. And at the end of the week, we were seeing 960 millibars, which was a drop of about 11 millibars throughout the week. And we had a couple significant drops between January 29th and 30th. We dropped about 6 millibars, and the same for January 31st to February 1st. I believe the pressure dropped so significantly because we went from an extreme cold front at the beginning of the observation period to a relatively warm front. While taking my observations on Saturday, there was plenty of ice fog covering as far as the eye could see, so it didn't really give you the chance to look up into the sky because it was completely covered with ice fog. And it was pretty still outside. There was no wind blowing. It was just very cold, very still, and very silent. That Sunday I did get to see some altocumulus clouds in the sky, and I believe they were altocumulus because they had a pretty flattened look, but going off of the Alaska Cloud and Weather Guide, they really resembled the whitish-gray kind of color of the altocumulus clouds. And they looked pretty flat as well. There was no precipitation on Saturday or Sunday, and on Sunday there was a slight breeze, but it was pretty irregular, probably just a Beaufort number of 2, where when you blew out you could see your breath blowing in the direction from the wind. The wind was coming from the southeast at about 220 degrees, but it wasn't coming steadily, so occasionally when I blew out I would notice that my breath was drifting to the north. I could also see that the smokestacks would occasionally drift to the north when a slight breeze would come. So again, that was about a Beaufort number of 2 because you could feel the wind on your face and see the smokestacks move, but the wind wasn't that strong. On Monday, the winds significantly increased. They were coming from the east, and I would say they were about a Beaufort number of 8. You could see that whole trees were in motion, and when you were walking toward the east, there was a significant resistance from the wind. The flags on the flagpoles were consistently waving, and if I had dropped something in the parking lot or at my home, say a piece of paper or something, it would have easily flown away in the wind. On Monday, I would say the skies were about 3/4 covered with clouds. They looked like nimbostratus clouds to the north, east, and west. They looked pretty thick, and they were quite gray underneath, and they were also pretty low. So I believed them to be nimbostratus, but to the south, the skies were actually pretty clear. That was the only area they were clear, and there looked to be some cirrus clouds in the south just scattered around. You could tell they were high in the sky, and they were just thin and really wispy looking, and they were pretty bright white. On Tuesday, there was a very, very slight wind coming from the south at about 210 degrees, but it was very, very faint. You could only really feel it if you licked your finger and stuck it out to the wind, where you could feel a little more coldness from the wind coming from the south. The skies were completely covered with nimbostratus clouds. Again, they were pretty gray and low, and there was a light snow coming down. This was the only day in the observation period that there was any precipitation. Then on Wednesday again, the skies were about 3/4 covered with nimbostratus. They were the same looking clouds from Tuesday and Monday that were thick and pretty gray, kept the sky pretty gloomy looking, and they were in the northeast and west with clearer skies in the south. And again, it looked like there were some cirrus clouds in the south because they were a high white wispy sort of looking cloud. And on Wednesday, we also had a pretty windy day, about a Beaufort number of 6. You could see the tops of trees were moving, the smaller trees were moving, the smokestacks were gushing towards the south. When you blew out, your breath would easily move to the south. There wasn't quite that much resistant felt moving against the winds, so it wasn't as strong as Monday, but Wednesday we did see, a pretty good breeze that was coming from the north at about 10 degrees. I would say that throughout the observations, everything went pretty smoothly. The only problems I ran into were really just those first couple of days when the temperatures were below 40. Your hands don't really, or below 40 below, I'm sorry, your hands don't really want to work when it's so cold outside. But once it started heating up, it was quite enjoyable.